talk centered around Dr. Umi Vaughan's book, Silencing the Drum, Religious Racism and Afro-Brazilian Sacred Music, covers Brazil's rich legacy and troubling current events, punctuated by, and you can see live, Afro-Brazilian drumming and dance. So Dr. Umi Vaughan is an independent artist and scholar who conducts research, creates photo-based visual art, performs music and dance, and publishes work that examines the evolution and meanings of music and dance traditions across the African diaspora. He holds a PhD in cultural anthropology from the University of Michigan and was formerly a professor of Africana Studies at California State University, Monterey Bay. He is the author of Carlos Aldama's Life in Bata, Cuba, Diaspora and the Drum, and Rebel Dance, Renegade Stance, Timba Music, and Black Cultural Identity. As I said, those are over there to be purchased by you. And without further ado, I'd like to bring up Umi Vaughan, and he will introduce his musicians as well. So let's welcome.
The drum speaks, tambo, the beat of life that always goes on, percussive spirit of sound. Ngoma zonza gizonza ka, the drum speaks, tambo kifala. Fala kifies, words that work, conjuring cadence. All over the world, in joy and pain, people move, people live, people love. To the beat. From Mbanza, Congo, Alada, and Old Oyo, on to São Salvador, da Bahia de Todos os Santos. Rio de Janeiro, São Luís de Maranhão, and Oakland. Where and what next? There are meetings at crossroads, beauty is born, journeys come full circle. We celebrate the continuity of life, we fight for our lives through the drum. I'd like to have a moment of silence for all those in Brazil who have lost their lives for their religious beliefs, and for some giants in music and arts that we lost recently. Roy Ayers, Roberta Flack, Angie Stone, Paulito F.A., and also for our fallen dance brother, Rashad Pridgen, Soul Nubian. Moment of silence. Thank you. Bongo gira jamugange, aya olele. Bongo gira jamugange, aya olele. Bongo gira jamugange, bongo gira jamugange, aya olele. Bongo gira jamugange, aya olele. Bongo gira jamugange, bongo gira jamugange, aya olele. Jamugange, aya olele. to acknowledge Skylar Lee, Cy Thompson, and Robert Lopez accompanying me on the drums. Thank you. Also, a big thanks to the Oakland Asian Cultural Center and to Indra Mungo for inviting us here. Entering intolerance. In September 2018, a religious community known as Ile Ashe Omoede Ekbe Logunede, a community located in the town of Iturama, Minas Gerais State, Brazil, was hosting an initiation ceremony. Neighbors of this temple called the authorities to complain about what they called noise pollution due to the playing of the sacred drums known as atabaque. Several cars full of police officers arrived on the scene, grabbed up the drums, and issued a citation to the religious leader, Pai Diego. The devotees were unable to complete the ceremony, costing them about $18,000 US in wasted food, ceremonial clothing, and fees for ritual officiants. The drums, which aren't supposed to be touched by people who aren't initiated, were held in the evidence locker at the police station for 15 days before they were returned. Pai Diego and the community members were never compensated for the cost of the aborted ceremony, nor the emotional distress of the invasion. This is just one example of a common problem in Brazil. Prejudiced persons are characterizing Afro-Brazilian sacred music as a form of moral and/or environmental pollution, and beyond that, committing acts of physical and institutionalized violence in an effort to silence the drum, to silence and erase Afro-Brazilian religious communities. So the book that we have put together, Silencing the Drum, explores the role of sacred music in Afro-Brazilian religions and gives detailed accounts of religious racism connected to music, particularly the drum. I situate myself and my co-author, Danielle Boaz, who's a professor at University of North Carolina, Charlotte. We situate these attacks within a long history of state repression and persecution of Afro-Brazilian religions. What we found in our research, which we conducted all over the country, was that although official policies and outside perceptions have varied over time in different regions, the drums have for centuries been targeted as a kind of primitive element to be rooted out of Brazilian culture. We found that attacks against the drum are happening in various ways, whether you're in northern Brazil, whether you're in the center of the country or in the south. Our hope is that we can, by raising awareness, help reach out to the right partners in government, in business, to bring real change to the situation. We argue that unless we do something now, these important musical traditions could be altered forever or even lost. Okay? So, what is candomblé? Right? Raise your hand if you've heard of that phrase before, candomblé. Good. It's, of course, and as we know, a kind of cousin religion to other African diasporic faiths like Santeria, Regla de Ocha from Cuba, or Vodun from Haiti, Chile, or the 21 Misterios from Dominican Republic, where African traditions from West and Central Africa were transported to the Americas, in this case to Brazil, and reimagined, incorporating indigenous practices, incorporating elements from folk Catholicism and Portuguese culture. Enslaved Bantu people came from West Africa, arriving as early as the start of the 16th century, early 1500s. These people would form what's called in Brazil the Angola nation within Candomblé. The 18th century saw Bay-speaking people from the empire of Dahomey arrive and form the Candomblé Jeje nation. Can you guys say Angola? Can you guys say Jeje? Yeah. In the early 19th century, with the effects of civil war, people from the Oyo Empire in what is today Nigeria were trafficked in high numbers to Brazil and collectively created the Ketu or Nago nation. Say Ketu. Say Nago. Each group maintained connections to languages, musical practices, and rituals brought from Africa and adapted for use in Brazil. In some cases, African divinities and ideas were disguised under and influenced by Catholic ideology and symbols, and of course, blended with indigenous ones. Let's have another musical example that can exemplify how Congo Africans who will be speaking languages like Kikongo um, began to incorporate Portuguese. So this is a rhythm that's called Congo de Ouro, and a song about a young man leaving out into the world with his mother's blessing, right? It's a reference, a song that calls on a deity that's called a caboclo, which is an indigenous entity. So this is Congo meets Native America, right? First, let's introduce the drums. The foundational piece is what's called the ga or agogo. It's a bell, metallic sound. Let's hear that, Sky. Good. And then we have the lay, high-pitched drum. We have the humping. Those two drums play supporting parts, and the leader in this case is a drum called hum. Can you say that? Hum. So here goes a song on Congo de Ouro. Foi nesse passo que eu saí da minha aldeia. Foi nesse passo que eu saí da minha aldeia. Montado no meu cavalo, com meu chapéu de lado. Quando aí a minha mãe me abençoava.
Foi nesse passo que eu saí da minha aldeia. Foi nesse passo que eu saí da minha aldeia. Montado no meu cavalo, com meu chapéu de lado. Quando eu saía, minha mãe me abençoava. Foi nesse passo que eu saí
da minha aldeia. Foi nesse passo que eu saí da minha aldeia. Montado no meu cavalo, com meu chapéu de lado. Quando saía, minha mãe me abençoava.
Nesse passo que eu saí da minha aldeia. Foi nesse passo que eu saí da minha aldeia. Montado no meu cavalo, com meu chapéu de lado. Quando eu saía, minha mãe me abençoava.
Yes, yes. Scholars refer to several basic beliefs of the Yoruba people that apply to each of the three nations of Candomblé. Just, for those of us who aren't familiar, to give us a sense of the religious practice that the music is supporting. There's one God who created and controls the universe and all that's contained therein. There are selected forces of nature called Orisha, called Inkisi, called Vodun, called Caboclo, and many other names as well, that deal with the affairs of humankind on earth and govern the universe. They believe that a person's spirit lives on after death and can reincarnate back into the world. Ancestor spirits have power over those who remain on earth and so must be remembered, appeased, honored, and consulted by the living. Think Day of the Dead, right? They believe in divination, communicating with ancestors, spirits, divinities, and other sacred entities using mediumship and or rituals employing tools such as seeds, nuts, or shells. Think Ifa, think I Ching. We're here at the Asian Culture Center. They believe in the use of offerings and animal sacrifice to elevate their prayers to the divinities, spirits, and ancestors. I like to always pause at this use of offerings and animal sacrifice. People often use that as a foothold to try and demonize and, downgrade the religions like Santeria, Vodun, etc. But really, it's just communing with nature, acknowledging that, you're taking the life of a being in order to nourish your own life, right? And I think that's actually beautiful. And the opposite of what, some of us Americans like to do. We don't like to know where our food comes from, right? We don't like to think about the farms where the animals are treated poorly, and that's where we get our chicken nuggets, right? So these religions kind of make that reciprocity sacred, right? They believe in the ability of rituals, practices, and unseen forces to impact the natural world. They believe in the use of medicinal herbs. Also, ritual song and dance are mandatory in certain ceremonies. And they believe that humans can commune with ancestors, Orisha, with God himself, through the vehicle of transpossession. Okay? These communities are centered around what are called tejeros. Can you say that? Tejero. Tejero is kind of like, a black church where there's a compound, a spiritual leader. Oftentimes a woman will live there. One of the beautiful things about the candomblé is the stature and the powerful position of women, particularly black women, indigenous women. These tejeros are the center of one's religious life. You will be initiated by a Pai de Santo, a Mai de Santo, to become a Pai de Santo or Mai de Santo in your own right later, but there are all kinds of other functions that make the Tejero go. People whose job is just to clean up, people's job is just to cook the food, people's job is to sacrifice the animals, and a kind of very well organized kind of community life develops around these Tejeros. The Tejeros have their own cadre of drummers, right? So it's not customary for drummers to hire themselves out. Like I play here, I play there. The drummers play for their home base Tejero, right? These Atabaki drums are a fascinating piece of African diaspora technology because they don't exist as such in Dahomey, the modern day nations of Benin, Togo. They don't exist as such in modern day nations like Democratic Republic of Congo, Gabon, etc., or in modern day Yoruba land. But these Afro-Brazilian descendants of those folks figured out how to adapt rhythms from all those places onto these drums. Sometimes in the Congo traditions, it's always open hands. In the Yoruba traditions, it's usually the lead drummer with an open hand and one stick, and the other two drummers with two sticks, and that same format for the Dahomey traditions. But this is a fascinating example of, what is that thing within your culture that you would refuse to let go of, right? If they took you from Oakland today and set you down somewhere else, what is it from here that you would, give your life for or exhaust all your ingenuity to maintain, right? These drums are that kind of a thing. In Candomblé, music accompanies many moments in the life of the Tejero, in the life of the temple or religious community. One of our informants said, tudo tem uma melodia, tudo tem batuque. Everything has a rhythm, everything has a melody. Drums accompany songs and prayers. Sometimes drums alone praise the Orisha. Drums accompany ritual animal sacrifices as a way to honor the lives of the animals and make their passage more pleasant. Drums are used along with song and dance to make spirit manifest in the bodies of devotees in the Tejero during celebrations they call Shire. Can you say that? Shire. Shire means to make goodness. So that's the purpose of the drums. In this question of the drum being demonized and kind of accused of immorality, it really flies in the face of what the drums are really about, shire, to make goodness, right? One of the reasons that we get into in the book that since colonial times the drums have been so maligned and so feared is the presence and the use of drums in rebellions of black people, right? Even in our own United States, we're seeing that we're kind of going back to colonial times in our country. And in 1739, I think it was, the Stonewall Rebellion took place in South Carolina, and historians have documented the use of the drum as an invocation to the rebels. You guys may have heard the Haitian Revolution. There were drums involved there too. So it's for a reason that, self-sufficiency, self-love, and resistance is associated with the drum. And so whenever a colonial government, whenever a state looks to sweep black people off their feet, the drum and the drummer is one of the first targets. Scholars also point out that Europeans were intimidated by African musical performances because they were unable to decipher their meaning. They were unfamiliar with the significance of the performance of the rhythms, and the songs that accompanied them were typically in African languages. The Africans could have been performing a call to arms, a display of mourning, a musical prayer, or any other expressions, but the Europeans had little grounds to differentiate between them and sought, therefore, to stop it all. The music that we're sharing with you guys, we're doing our rendition of music recorded by Brazilian masters included with the book. If you go online, you can hear recorded versions of these songs and references to, to different tracks at different moments in the book. And so at one point I talk about, this instinct to protect our traditions, right? This instinct to resist. And Ogun is a Yoruba Orisha that's associated with iron, anything having to do with iron, airplanes, taxi cabs, barbers and butchers have to do with Ogun. Ogun is also associated with war, right? And so if we can consider ourselves as religious practitioners in a war to kind of save our traditions, we think about Ogun being with us. They say Ogun na frente, right? Ogun on the front line, right? So let's share a song for Ogun. Shalare Ogun onire orere Ogun onire ogoro onire One of the beautiful things about Candomblé and these kind of African diasporic religions is that the good book, as it were, is written on people's bodies and inscribed in the music. So when we want to teach community values like, well, what does virility look like? You're like, well, let's hear a rhythm for Shango. Or when you want to think about what does fertility and ultimate sensuality and femininity look like, well, let's hear from Oshun, right? So these poems in motion are teaching tools. By participating, by observing, children and people who are part of these communities learn about life through performance, right? It's their danced good book we could think about. Anybody ever been to Carnival in Brazil? I went one time in Salvador, and I went in Rio de Janeiro. It's fascinating that many of the samba schools in Rio de Janeiro are not secretly, but not, usually very publicly associated with different Orisha, right? Salgueiro, I think Shango, right? Mangueira, I think Yansan. The 2025 Rio de Janeiro Carnival became a kind of de facto protests by the Samba schools against this rising wave of intolerance against African candomblé. Almost all of the Samba schools presented themes that were based on either straight up Orisha or kind of indigenous, religions. Like, so half of the song was in Yoruba or the other half was in Kikongo. And it became a thing. There was pushback. Some of the judges who, may not be actually even from Samba schools or something like that were like, you're disqualified because you didn't understand what you're saying. Why was there so much African talk in this, in the Samba schools theme? And so it just goes to kind of show how interesting that is, that these schools would take the world stage that is the Brazilian carnival and kind of expose this hypocrisy, right? Because everybody thinks about Brazil, and what's the first thing you think? Either soccer or carnival, right? Samba. But there would be no samba without these tejeros, without the candomblé, right? Robert, can we do one example? Can you play just the lay part nice and slow from Samba de Caboclo? So the rhythm that we started off with, that rhythm is called Cabula or Samba de Caboclo. And it kind of gives the pulse that will become the samba that we know from Mangueira and the samba schools, or from your favorite pagode artist, Zeca Pagodinho, Arlindo Cruz, right? So So the notion that Brazil will, pride itself on samba and at the same time allow the foundations of it to be attacked is unfortunate, to say the least, right? Another side of that is, if you're watching FIFA football, soccer, the World Cup, there might be a commercial for Guaraná or something, and what might you hear? The Ijexá rhythm. So these kind of rhythms are omnipresent in Brazilian culture, but they're, the roots of them are being allowed to be, attacked or undercut, right? Before we go to some questions, I want to play one of those rhythms that moves from the Tejero out into the public sphere, out into the world. People play this rhythm in carnival. There's a group called Filhos de Gandhi, the sons of Gandhi, who represent peace, and they go out into the carnival and they sing versions of Orisha songs as part of their carnival procession. So this is the Ijexá rhythm that's out in the world. Gilberto Gil, Caetano Veloso, Seu Jorge. Many people have Ijexá-based rhythms. And I want to use this rhythm as a way to think about the specific virtuosity that especially lead drummers develop. People think oftentimes about the drum circle and beat them drums, go bang on the drum, when we really should be thinking about it as speaking through the drum. When we should be thinking about, a very refined and specific language that's being executed with the drum, right? There's a book by Amanda Vilpastor. She calls it Bata Drums, Ancient Text Messaging of the Yoruba, right? So the notion that, you're not banging, you're speaking. The drummers who learn to play this stuff dedicate their lives, and it's kind of like a quilt. You take a little bit from this master, this teacher, a little bit from the other part your heart gives you, the other part of ancestor will whisper in your ear, and that's the style that you bring to the table. So we're going to just give a little Ijexá, and I want to teach a song that we're going to sing with it too. Will you guys sing with us? Yes. Okay. The first part of the song goes Iye Ye. The second part, Ye Shoro Do. Iye Ye. yeah, choro do. So it goes, yeah, choro do. Choro do. And so in these kind of call and response situations, you'll sing one thing and my part as the leader for now will be another, but you hold your part. Let's try it and then we'll go to music. Choro do, oro ma, pepe, choro do. Choro do, oro ma, pepe, choro do. Beautiful. So each player has his own little groove. I'm gonna play for a while, then Robert, and then we're gonna all sing together. So we're gonna get to some question and answer right now. Welcome to our think tank. Because what we would love to come up with is some concrete suggestions about what we can do here and what we can help folks in Brazil do to correct this problem. It could be a matter of, somebody here knowing somebody at the corporation who has some money to donate, or it could be somebody who can get to Michelle Obama. She could, literally what are some things we can do to make concrete help, right, for folks on the ground in Brazil? So let's ask some questions.
We're gonna ask you to speak to the mic so the videographer can catch it.
Hello. I was just curious about the congregations of the Tejeros and is it pretty diverse or as far as racially, um, or is it dependent on where location in Brazil?
Oh, that is a great question. Communities Tejeros were founded, um, like they have this process that they call tombamento, where they can get kind of UNESCO or state kind of recognition, and they get it in order to go through this process. They submit documents about when the Tejeros were founded, for example. So there's Tejeros that may have been founded in the mid 1800s in Rio de Janeiro, in this area that they call now Little Africa. And during that early era, most of these were kind of family based and then grew out. And so most of the people would be actual Yoruba, like, you know, saltwater Africans, as you were, really straight up come from Yoruba land, and then their family members and then their descendants. But as time went on, people from other African ethnic groups by affinity might join that Tejero as well. People from other racial groups, white folks might be become involved with the Herald because they recognize the power and the beauty of it. They might be welcomed in sometimes because of the political leverage that they can bring to the table. There's instances of like, some governor or mayor in Rio de Janeiro becoming associated with a Tejero, becoming a Hogan, becoming part of the committee of directors, not really because they had such a big voice, but because it could be a kind of shield against the racism that's always been kind of affecting the Tejeros. So in terms of racial diversity within the Tejero, mostly black folks, but in Brazil, blackness is a big spectrum, right? Dark people like me or people who look like George Yalabe, a black man with green eyes, you know what I mean? And very fair skin. So there's that diversity there too. Does that answer your question?
Hi. So I'm curious about why is it that in some place like Brazil, especially when it seems as if so much of the culture or the way that they present the culture externally, so much of it is based in African traditions, but how did it come to be something that's seen as Brazilian as opposed to African? Because, if you look at the parallels between how we've evolved here in the US, and it's like there's definitely similarities, and yet it seems like our traditions are fairly firmly defined as, Black American and not as American.
I think that's a good question. I think a lot of it lies in the fact that, there's clear relationship, but there's distinct difference. Sometimes the difference stems from the fact that, say, Africans came off of a ship from Yoruba land in 1850, and they came with the songs that they were singing at that time and the ritual procedures that they were doing, and they're like, this is what we do. This is going to be the foundation of what's happening here, the Yoruba Brazil. Meanwhile, in Lagos and Ibadan and like that, in Nigeria, stuff kept moving on, evolving in its own different way. And so fast forward 200 years later, it's just a different thing, you know what I mean? Even though it has African roots. And so rather than, disagree about well, this should be that way or the other, they just consider it their own thing, right? And I think that your question makes me think also like if Brazil represents itself as so African sometimes, right, for tourists and because of samba vibes that this happened, it feels like the same love-hate relationship that America has with black culture here, right? Where Snoop Dogg is at the inauguration, but then they're also throwing up Nazi symbols. They say people love the blues, but they don't love the people who make the blues. So a similar kind of energy around the candomblé and Brazilian blackness too.
It seems like they relabeled it maybe a bit more than we do. Because I think that if we're talking about, for like gospel music, or the blues, I still think that their position in American culture is more closely associated with Blackness, whereas I feel like this is not just a Brazilian thing. It seems like something that's common in Latin America. They kind of associate a lot of things with, the Iberian Peninsula, as opposed to, the African, people and their descendants.
I'm not sure. Like, for example, there's a whole thing, there's a guy named Luis Simas. He's kind of like the Brazilian Robert Farris Thompson or something, a kind of white-looking guy, but who is kind of channels black culture and is seen as authentic. And he talks about how the culture of samba, even though it's the national culture in some ways, is also, though, looked down upon. Like, if you're a samba dude, like, people are going to be like, oh, that's such and such, So, I think it's a strong association with blackness in the music, too. Thank you.
I'm pretty curious, can you define a little bit more what the issue right now is? It sounds like religious persecution.
Mm-hmm.
Are they closing the heroes? Are they imprisoning people? What more specifically is happening?
So my co-author, Dr. Danielle Boaz, she has a website that tracks and has a map. It's listed on the back of the book, where you can see all the different kinds of cases of religious racism or religious intolerance in Brazil. But for example, terreiros being burned, people at ceremonies being stoned, like stones being thrown through the windows. People have been beaten with literal Bibles in the street, old women, priestesses. People have been, there's a story in the book about a woman who, out in the outskirts of Rio de Janeiro, some evangelical drug traffickers, oxymorons, right? Showed up at her house, knocked on the door. Excuse me, excuse me, but you've been having drumming ceremonies. That's going to need to stop, or we're going to kill you, right? And what did she do in terms of her reaction? She got the biggest speaker she could find and began to blast gospel music outside and continued to play the drums inside, right? So those are some of the kind of specific cases. Other cases are like noise pollution. So in a community where the church, the evangelical church, blasts music and they're on the microphone all day long and nobody says nothing. But the terreiro that's been there longer than any of it will have a ceremony that happens from 6 to 9 on 3 days of the month, and then this one neighbor will call, nobody else, just one neighbor will call, and then the police will be there, and there will be fines and all this kind of stuff. So, things like that. This gentleman in the back had his hand up.
I don't think I need a microphone. You can hear me okay? Just like in America, we got imitators take the culture and then we could, erase the roots and take it. In Brazil, are there groups of Brazilians who are imitators and of the Congolese, and do they experience the same violence?
Oh, interesting. One of the ways that evangelicals and the mega churches have sought to try and turn communities away from their ancestral religion is by taking certain practices that everybody loves, that everybody digs, and kind of rebranding it as Jesus something or other. So they have anybody ever had a acarajé before? Acarajé? It's like a bean fritter made from black eyed peas mashed, fried in red palm oil, cut open like cornbread kind of, and then filled with all delicious stuff, scrimps and whatnot. And so it's an African thing, it's a Yoruba thing, and these women who wear the Yoruba gear and the white dresses, and beads and stuff are the people who make it traditionally. So they've been trying to rebrand it as acarajé, Jesus Ruiz, like Jesus cakes. You know what I mean? It's corny as heck, right? But it's a thing, right? Or they've been taking spiritual baths, you know, with certain herbs and such, and trying to rebrand it as a Jesus bath. You know, things that they know people do, right? As a way to kind of rest the membership, take away your membership. Like, go come to your church and take away your father, your congregation. Right?
Aren't there white Brazilians who are practicing unbled?
There's two things that we observed in our research. There are so many Afro-Brazilian religions or Afro-Indigenous religions. I'm speaking of Candomblé now, but there's mention of various others in the book, which, you know, are related to Candomblé in some ways, but owe it nothing, kind of different offshoots. There's a faith that's called Umbanda, which kind of brings in a little bit more Catholicism, brings in Kardecian spiritism, and a whole bunch of other stuff. And the practitioners of that are often more towards the whiter side of the Brazilian population. And so they are targets of religious intolerance, but less so, we found, than kind of the lay practitioners of these tejeros where everybody black, right? So there's that.
Are they playing the same rhythms?
They're using the same drums. They don't have to always play in three. Sometimes it can be one drum, or it can be a whole grid of drums playing. It's less codified than Candomblé is. So you said, are there white imitators? I have another thought with it escapes right now. But, you know, the Umbanda is, some people consider it a whitening of the Candomblé. Oh, what I was thinking is this. I spoke of black women being kind of in the control in the tejeros, right? Such and such, my Jasiara, my Stella, right? All this kind of stuff. And so a lot of times people who are more white presenting Brazilians, we mentioned Africa too, what they'll do is they'll go to Nigeria and go through some initiations and move over there and come back and use that as a way to say, well, I know better. Or, you know, so sometimes that happens and it's not in the spirit of like, let's add on, let's harmonize, but rather of like, let me gain a voice where as a white person I wouldn't have had one, you know what I mean? So let me get some African authority. Isn't that weird? Kind of ironic.
But are they doing it for financial gain or?
You know, it's like a murky water, like for financial gain because there's money involved in this, or sometimes maybe they feel like it's a spiritual thing and they want a voice in the community that they wouldn't have otherwise because their grandmother was no kind of priest, you know what I mean? And they don't have the ancestral claim in the same way. So they'll say, well, let me get a stamp of approval from the source, as it were, right?
I have a question. I know a little bit about your family, your mom's involvement with West African dance or African dance, and how did you fall in love with Cuba? I know it's
Cuba and Brazil?
Brazil, yeah. Sorry, I every time I'm listening to it, I'm thinking,
It's related.
okay,
So,
how did you fall in love?
My mom is Deborah Vaughan. I'm the co-founder of Dimensions Dance Theater. And, you know, that dance theater comes through a line of like Catherine Dunham and Miss Ruth Beckford, where we're kind of bringing together, looking for parallels, harmonizing cultures of the African diaspora, kind of combining research, you know, think Ailey and Pearl Primus, you know, research with stage dance, etc. And in her travels, she would always kind of include me, sometimes take me along, but oftentimes precede me in different places and say, well, you need to go to that place. One of the books that I have over there is called Rebel Dance, Renegade Dance, and I have a photograph of a postcard she sent me from Cuba with some Shango accoutrements on there saying, hey, you gotta go here one day. So I fell in love with Cuba and did work there. And, you know, people talk about Puerto Rico and Cuba being two wings of the same bird. I often feel like really that's more Cuba and Brazil two wings of the same bird, with these African cultures deeply rooted there, you know? So, 2007, I went to a meeting of the Caribbean Studies Association, which, you know, mostly is on Caribbean islands, but they have a meeting in New Orleans sometimes because of the Circle Caribbean connection, and they had this meeting in Brazil, kind of, it's, you know, the outskirts of the Caribbean, as it were. And my dad and I went, and, you know, I really loved it, you know, the language, something about it felt right to me, so I started to learn Portuguese. This was 2007, and I met one of my great friends and collaborators, Messi Mario. He's one of the leaders of the group Ile a samba group and social action group from Salvador Bahia. He was the musical director for the recording that accompanies Silencing the Drum, Mario Vaughan. So learning music with him, kind of becoming friends and brothers with him, and just, you know, being fascinated by so many countries in one, Brazil is, you know, and, you know, wanting to be, feel useful, you know what I mean? You know, okay, you're learning drum rhythm, okay, that's good. Okay, you're gonna go to the carnival, but what can I do to help and, like, you know, do something meaningful? And so that's where this is all come from.
Thank you. Any other questions?
In terms of the current wave of repression, I mean, what are the really pronounced triggers? I mean, of course, you got the legacy since forever of the racism, but on top of that, is it the rise of the evangelical church and the you know, the right-wing politics that seem to be surging all around the world? Or what are the real triggers that, you know, people
It's
need to
like,
fight against?
thank you, that's a very wonderful question. One of the triggers seems to be economic, because like Too Short said one time, there's money in the ghetto, right? So, you know, the spending power that would be used to, say, conduct the ceremony that Pi Diego was doing, that I started out my presentation with, like that money could instead go to the coffers of the church, it go in the donation box. So that's one impulse, right? Also, the Tejeros kind of supply basic services for humble communities, right? If, you know, if you're hungry, you can go to the Tejero and they'll give you a plate of food, or, you know, allow you to bathe, or, you know, those kind of things. The Tejero has never achieved any kind of relationship with the government like that, where they get money to help do those things, whereas the church can, right? The church is a non-taxable entity, and so if the church can say, instead of being members of the Tejero, all these black people in this area belong to my church, I can also get money from the state to do that. I can also then swing their vote one way or the other. So money, political leanings is all part of the thing. And then add on top of that, you know, just a kind of colonial rumble of anti-blackness, anti-Africa, a right-wing political leader that's kind of allowing people's racism to kind of just voice itself unchecked, you know what I mean? So like, you can hear, you know, on a lot of days, if you're looking on Instagram, you have Brazilian friends, there'll be some kind of post about somebody's mic was hot and they got heard saying, you know, black people, you know, should go back to slavery, and just wild stuff that people are saying, like, you know, you're like, wow, that was like 2025, but it is. You know what I mean? So I think there's multiple triggers.
Thank you.
So as we adjourn to maybe do a little book signing, we're gonna play a rhythm by a samba group called Ile. And this rhythm represents the kind of marriage of Tejero rhythms with the Batucada samba from Rio de Janeiro. And it's gonna just be a funky groove for us to kind of change locations. Okay? Thank you very much. Give yourself a round of applause. Thank you. See you over there.
very curious about what actually the religion and the racism or oppression they are related, in Brazil. Yesterday, last night, actually, there was 2 nights before. I went to Berkeley and enjoyed Brazil dance, and it's kind of like abstract ones, and then it's Afro-Brazilian dance. So coincidentally, this performance and presentation is related. I learned pretty much a lot, and actually somehow kind of answered my questions about the racism part of in Brazil. I heard a lot about that, but now I'm secondhand to know directly from people they actually observe and do research about it. Yeah. The part I can sense the injustice from the presenters, of course the drummers. I feel it can actually kind of reflect on what we have in U.S., right? It's always, I would say that the minorities of people, they are controlling our lives. Even though, of course, the people in power, I would just say, not to say the race part of it, is more like people they have, they in charge of what our life is supposed to go, or where the direction of the country is supposed to go. I think it's kind of parallel in the sense of Brazil, they're struggling, and now U.S. is kind of going to the direction of they are heading. Yeah. Even though we used to be having more, we enjoy more freedom. Now it's more like a dictatorship. Taking over. So, unfortunately, we are going backward to where Brazil they are at.
I really appreciate him bringing light to this subject. I'm Brazilian, and my dad, he was I don't know how the word to say in English, like a priest for the Juremas, the Afro-Indigenous religion, and I seen him suffering racism, and he was in his deathbed, and the other relatives of the family forcing him to accept Jesus, right the moment that he most need the comfort, right? So it was really hard for me. So I really appreciate that he joined the cause. Yeah. I really love to see the dance and the music. I wasn't expecting it, and yes. Mm-hmm. I felt joy and a warm feeling, yes. Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things that was interesting is I didn't realize that the drums that they were using had actually been changed from the original drums. It's always kind of interesting to me to see the different forms that kind of African traditions take in the Americas, being descended from the North American, route of the Middle Passage, and then just kind of getting to see the ways that, Afro-Brazilians, who I think, again, tend to be very much hidden until certain times. I feel like you see them during a World Cup, you see them during the Olympics, but I think in a lot of times in media, we don't see them to the point that a lot of Americans don't think that Afro-Brazilians even exist. So, it's kind of fascinating when you see that these traditions, again, have, I think, become seen as Brazilian culture and Brazilian tradition. And, as you said, kind of in a love-hate way. Right. I've seen people say that. I've seen people tell someone who's a little bit brown, with curly hair, oh, you look Brazilian. And, I've actually said, you know what, we all look Brazilian. You probably just aren't familiar with really the diversity and the fact that that's the largest Black population outside of the African continent. I just found it very, it was very, beautiful. But, for me, I was just also thinking about Black, kind of religious tradition and Black music. And so just maybe think of those kinds of things. So just the parallel and kind of knowing that there's this distant, first cousin of everything that I would say I grew up with, that they have there and that they've managed to keep alive, again, under, honestly, I think in many ways a lot more challenging circumstances. My grandfather was a minister, and we have other ministers in the family. So it's kind of like my parents, I feel like, treated religion more like a huge part of our culture and history, as opposed to kind of like indoctrination. So they were very I think liberal about that, and we went to a lot of different black churches, and I mean, actually I was raised Lutheran, so I didn't officially belong to a black church, but we were taken to visit all of these different, African Methodist Episcopal, black Presbyterian churches, black Baptist churches, because again, it's like an important part of the culture and the history. The only books I had really read before were more about kind of the racial politics and the way that kind of racial identification diverged in the absence of Jim Crow. I mean, I think you see that a lot of the results are the same, but the way people define it and the way that people define themselves is, I think, very different.